Hello and welcome from ABN Satellite TV and the Trinity Channel. My name is Dr. Daniel Janosik, and I will be your host for this particular presentation. This is going to be a very helpful one. We are going to deal with the topic on man's origin, the creation and its implications. Now, I teach at Southern Evangelical Seminary as an apologetics professor, and I also teach on the subject of Islamic studies, but I taught biology at Columbia International University for about 20 years, so I will try to weave these things together and ask our excellent panel to help us understand the implications on the origin of man, especially when we think of the whole controversy that is going on now in the scientific world vis-a-vis the Bible and biblical creation in the sense of whether we have a historical Adam and Eve. There's a lot of commotion in this area. So we're going to explore this through some of the material that we will mention, but primarily from our three speakers, our guests. We have Dr. Fazale Rana, Faz Rana, from Reasons to Believe. He is the Vice President of Research and Apologetics, and as a biochemist, he still writes and speaks extensively about evidence for creation, emerging from biochemistry, genetics, human origins, and synthetic biology. He has a couple of great books out. We're going to detail one of those on the origin of man today. Now, as Vice President of Research and Apologetics at Reasons to Believe, he is dedicated to communicating to skeptics and Christians alike the powerful scientific case for God's existence and the Bible's reliability. As far as his background, he received his Bachelor of Science in Chemistry at West Virginia State College, and then he went to the university, Ohio University, I should say, OU, Ohio University, and got his PhD in chemistry with an emphasis in biochemistry, one of the fields that I really enjoy. And so I enjoyed listening to him because he is one of the adjunct professors at Southern Evangelical Seminary, and he also teaches at Biola University. So he's got some books out. One is called The Cell's Design, and another one is on man's origin. So Fuz, welcome to the show. I look forward to hearing from you as we go on.
Well, thank you for having me.
Okay, so we have Dr. Faz Rana, and secondly, we are going to hear from Jonathan McLatchie. Jonathan McLatchie is a Christian writer, speaker, and debater. He holds a bachelor's degree from, in forensic biology. I'd like to talk to you sometime about forensic biology and what that includes. He has a master's degree in evolutionary biology, so this will fit in very well with what we're talking about, and another master's degree in medical and molecular bioscience. And he is currently involved in a PhD program as a student in cell biology. So we'll hear some good stuff from Jonathan McLatchie. He is a proponent of the scientific theory of intelligent design, about which he has written extensively on Evolution News and Views and Uncommon Descent, and he is involved with the Center for Intelligent Design in the UK. So Jonathan, it's great to have you aboard, and we look forward to hearing from you in this show.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. And thirdly, we have the new dean from the school where I teach, Southern Evangelical Seminary, J.T. Bridges. Dr. Bridges received his Bachelor of Science from Iowa State University, so he's one of those Midwestern guys. And then he went down to Texas to get his MDiv, which he received from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. And a little bit later, he picked up a master's in philosophy from Baylor University, and that's his specialty now. So when he received his PhD in the philosophy of religion at Southern Evangelical Seminary, he really focused on that area. So we're going to have him keep us on track with all the philosophical assumptions and the stray thoughts that we may have. So we'll really depend on him to keep us aligned. So, Dr. Bridges, it's good to have you on this show.
Oh, thanks, Daniel.
So that's the lineup. Dr. Fazale Rana from Reasons to Believe, Jonathan McLatchie, who works with ID, Intelligent Design, and then J.T. Bridges, Dr. Bridges, teaching philosophy and other things at the Southern Evangelical Seminary. So what we want to do is kind of parse out this whole idea of the origin of man, deal with the idea of whether we can bridge faith and science, or the Bible and science in this area. There are a lot of questions that we need to deal with in this regard. So my primary question will be this: how can we deal with this idea of the interface between Bible and science? Is it something that is exclusive, or can we put it together? And if we can, why is that important? Dr. Rana, Fazale Rana, I wonder if you could start us off and just tell us why it's important to explore this particular interface.
Well, when you look at scientific advances that have happened, many of these advances are dealing with questions of origins. And of course, Scripture itself is also dealing with questions of origins as well. And so there is an overlap between what science is interested in and what Scripture is interested in that sense. We see from Scripture the idea that God has revealed himself to us through the record of nature. And so science is a study of the record of nature, so we would expect that if indeed the biblical account is true, that we should see evidence that points to a creator's existence. The Scriptures are filled full of creation accounts that, again, address the question of origins. We understand those creation accounts as being reliable, and so therefore we should expect to see harmony between these creation accounts and the scientific record. This is, in a sense, foundational to establishing, I think, the credibility of the Christian faith, particularly in a world that's dominated by science and technology.
Okay, appreciate that. Let's go to Jonathan for a moment. And Jonathan, I want you to add to that, but why is it an important aspect? Or let me put it this way. We have a lot of evolutionists who would not agree with this. They would say that you cannot bring the science and the Bible together. What would you say to people like this? Where would you take them, or how would you answer that question? What is the linkage between these two things?
Well, first thing I say is that Scripture is not a scientific textbook, but it does make scientific claims. It does touch on scientific topics. The issue of creation, did the universe begin to exist? That's a scientifically testable claim. The Bible makes very scientific claims. It makes claims about the origin of humanity. It makes claims of what we should expect to see when we look at science. And so I think it's vitally important that we seek to integrate our Christian faith with science, and we use the tools of science to investigate these questions and try to determine whether we are, as Scripture would have it, the product of a mind, or are we the product of stochastic, blind, fundamentally random processes of chance and necessity, natural selection acting on random genetic mutation. So I think if the Christian faith is making specific claims, truth claims about reality, then these claims are open to scrutiny, and they're either true or false. And if they're false, then we don't want to be Christians. We don't want to live our life based upon a delusion. We only want to believe in Christianity if, in fact, it is true and it stands up to academic and scientific scrutiny.
Okay, that's good. We're showing how the Bible and science do work together. JT, I wonder if you can look at the philosophical undergirding and tell us what would be the assumption of, say, the evolutionists who disregard the Bible, and why would they say that you cannot use the Bible in regard to science?
Well, I think it's dangerous in dealing with academic topics to make broad, sort of monolithic statements. But I would say that there are there are trends along three different lines. The late Stephen Jay Gould coined the acronym NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria, and what he meant by that is that science deals with empirical fact and testable hypotheses, and the Bible deals largely with matters of faith and morality. And so we could put it proverbially that science tells us how the heavens go, and the Bible tells us how to go to heaven. Then you would have people that are more radical. Somebody like a Richard Dawkins who thinks that faith is just simply blind faith, and it's not veridical. It's not truth bearing at all. It's just simply superstition. And then you have some people of faith, some Christians on the other hand, that simply don't want to integrate science and faith claims because they, I think, fear that science has been a tool for undermining faith, and so the way to keep it from undermining faith is just to reject it altogether. But as I think Fuzz and Jonathan would agree, that the intellectually virtuous approach would be to try and find an integration between the two. Now, speaking about the philosophical undergirdings of there's in the philosophy of science, there are a myriad of positions that sketch out along more or less realist lines, which I think are probably just a bit tangential to the human origins and creationism questions. So maybe we can come back to those if they play more of a central role in the conversation. But I think in sketching out the broad boundary lines to the question of science and faith, we would say that probably Dawkins and Gould and the Fideists are probably the three broad categories. That science only, science and faith in hermetically sealed containers, and then faith only. Those would be the three positions that we want to avoid in trying to integrate faith and science.
Thank you. That was a very helpful way of showing the differences. I appreciate especially the idea of pneuma, the noma, the non-overlapping magisterial areas, and that's what a lot of non-theistic evolutionists would appeal to, that you cannot put them together, and yet the four of us as Christians find that you cannot keep them apart, because the whole idea of the Bible and science relates to every part of our life. So this next question I want to ask each one of you, so be thinking of it. I'm going to go to Fuzz first, and it's basically this. Can you give an example of the impact of beliefs about human origins? We're focusing on human origins. Can you give us an example of how that may impact our beliefs as Christians?
Yeah, well, when it comes to the question of human origins, this has profound implications in terms of how we view ourselves as human beings, as individuals. It has profound implications in terms of what we think of our value, our meaning in life. It has implications in terms of how society functions and the types of things that we would allow and disallow within a culture. It all connects again back to the question of human origins, because if we believe that we are the product of unguided, undirected evolutionary processes, then we would essentially be one of a countless number of species that has existed throughout the history of the earth, that we are not special, that we have no unique status among anything that we see in nature, and therefore human life is ultimately meaningless, it's ultimately purposeless, it has no intrinsic value. And so when we look at things like abortion or end-of-life issues, the decisions that we make as individuals and as a society connect back to, again, our view of human origins. If we think, however, human beings are made in God's image, that we have intrinsic value and intrinsic worth, intrinsic dignity, then we're going to think about abortion rights differently. We're going to think about end-of-life issues differently than if we think humans are the product of of evolution. So this is not a trivial question by any means. It has broad-ranging implications.
Fuzz, come back to you. Do you think that then has perhaps set up the way that our society now is looking at man, that we have abortion that is so rampant, euthanasia coming more and more on the scene, the whole idea of morals going out the window? Is that an effect of putting the Bible off to a certain corner and saying it doesn't affect our lives and putting so much emphasis on just secular science?
Yes, Daniel, I think you're onto something, really significant, because if we, as Christians, allow our faith to be compartmentalized and not to influence our lives or all aspects of our lives, I should say, and we don't allow our faith to influence the way in which we engage and interact with our culture, then again, things that we're seeing that are happening before our very eyes that we detest as Christians in our culture are a manifestation, I think, in large measure of how we view the origin of humanity. And we live in a world that's dominated by science and technology. And the mainstream scientific view is that human beings have evolved. And again, the implications are rather startling in that ultimately human life cannot have meaning and purpose, and ultimately there is no intrinsic value to humanity. And so this idea of human beings being made in God's image, humanity coming from a primordial pair that gave rise to all humanity, is, again, very important in terms of how we think of the value of human life, but it also is an idea that's foundational to the Christian faith itself. Many key doctrines that are part of Christianity rest on this idea, or these ideas that are related to the human origin story. So when, as Christians, we neglect to treat this account seriously, and we don't look for ways in which we can establish that this account has credibility, we really are eroding, I think, key ideas that are foundational to the faith. And the net result could be that the way Christianity looks in the future is going to be very different than it has looked throughout much of its history.
Excellent overview there. You covered a lot. I wonder, though, I'd like to bring Jonathan in on this. Jonathan, can you think of other ways that human origins may impact our beliefs as Christians?
Yeah, I would like to second everything Fuzz has said. I completely agree with what he said. I would go to, just to give one example, Romans chapter 5, verse 12, we read, "Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. For sin indeed was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not counted where there is no law. Yet death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam, who was a type of the one who was to come." And so Paul here in the book of Romans, and also elsewhere, grounds the whole doctrine of salvation in the creation narrative, the fact there really was an historical Adam, a historical Eve, a primordial pair, if you will, and that they really did screw up and mess up in the Garden of Eden. They fell, they sinned, they ate of the forbidden tree, and so they brought into the world a curse, and that curse is death. And so I think I think denying the historicity of this primordial pair, Adam and Eve, has fundamental implications to your theology downstream of that, specifically in this case, the whole message of the gospel of the atonement. From what did Christ rescue us if, in fact, there was no original fall? So I think that's a real problem. I think it's also your view about the means by which man was brought about. If you adopt a theistic evolutionary type of paradigm, then you basically are asserting that man is a result of a stochastic, mindless mechanism of chance and necessity, and not even God can direct an unguided process. It's simply, I think, highly corrosive to a traditional orthodox view of God's providence, His creation, and so forth. So I think it does have fundamental implications to how you view theology and how how your Christian faith works itself out.
Excellent. And that does show how important a biblical view is, because if we do not have an historical Adam and Eve, then we can't talk very intelligently about what sin would do to us. And so you throw sin out the window. It has no meaning. As Fuzz said, our lives are really meaningless if we do not connect the scientific area to the Bible. JT, you deal with fundamental issues. What would you say in regard to this whole area?
Well, I would say that, belief in our views on origins has have profound beliefs both in the way we think of ourselves as a group, so in terms of human society and human politics, political systems. So, for example, the Nazis, being very influenced by neo-Darwinian thinking, they felt scientifically justified in purging what they considered inferior genetic lines from the Aryan race, right? So there's a way in which belief about human origins had drastic practical moral consequences in the history of man. But also in terms of the way we view our own personal morality and our destiny. So if humans are only really smart animals and we're only materialistic things, then there's nothing that survives after death. The view of the human soul is illusory. But I think one of the other things that is a fundamental challenge to Christianity is the nature of marriage. So when Jesus talks about the relationship of man and woman, he goes back to this primordial pair of Adam and Eve. And if Adam and Eve didn't actually exist, there are two things that are implications of that. Number one, that the marriage relationship itself is called into question. But even more importantly, Jesus, who is God incarnate, was mistaken, right? And if that's the case, then as Jonathan said earlier, then we certainly should not be Christians if we think that Jesus, who's God incarnate, was actually mistaken about the origin of man.
I like that angle. I'm going to stay with you on this next question, JT, so I'm going to have you answer it first, since you deal with axiology, which would be the study of values, and this is a value evaluation. The question would be this: how can we convince people there is unique value in human lives, especially those who may not see that? How can we convince them? What would we need to do?
Well, I think there's a difference between having a reasonable argument that's backed up with sound reason and good evidence, and that evidence being compelling for the individual. Because as Anthony Flew says in his book, There Is a God, he says he says this explicitly, that people can be persuaded by horrible arguments, and people can fail to be persuaded by reasonable arguments. And so it's not really a test of the reasonableness of one's position that one finds a person disagreeing with us. And so I think we should be just this sort of a broad apologetic point, that when we find people that are unconvinced by our arguments and our rationale, that itself is not indicative that those arguments or that rationale is faulty or weak, because some people can fail to be persuaded by reasonable arguments. And so that's sort of a prolegomena to my more direct answer. And the more direct answer would be this: if we think that I don't I don't study axiology very much. My main areas are usually metaphysics and epistemology. So I'll talk a little bit about natural law. What natural law says is that we can once you know the nature of something, then it makes sense to say that there are some things that this thing should do by nature, and there are some things that this thing ought not do by nature. So, for example, philosopher Edward Fazer talks about, imagine if you found a squirrel who was obsessively eating toothpaste, that the only thing it wanted to eat was toothpaste, right? We would say that that's abnormal behavior and that the squirrel ought not do that. And we know that based on what squirrels are and what they need for a healthy diet, among nuts, among other things. I don't know. And so the question becomes, are humans the sort of thing that have a defined and a metaphysically objective nature? And if we say yes, they are the sorts of things that have a metaphysically objective nature, then there are things that objectively humans ought to do to fulfill that nature and ought not do because it's these, whatever the actions or activities are destructive to that nature. And now the question then becomes, well, what is a plausible explanation for this metaphysically objective human nature? And after some interesting argumentation, we would find that it's God, right? And that's the ultimate problem with evolutionary thinking about human origins, is that it undercuts this entire line of evidence that human lives are objectively definable, and that because they're definable within certain parameters, that there are things that we ought and ought not do objectively, which gives rise to an objective morality, for which in turn gives the theological doctrine of sin some ground to stand on. But if evolutionary thinking is correct, if secular evolutionists are correct, then what we call human nature is really, on a broader timeline, just another in a countless number of transitions between one species and the next. And the fixity of human nature is illusory.
Okay, that really sets us up well for the next segment. We're going to be taking a break in a couple of minutes. But when we come back, I really want to project from this foundation, because we can see that if indeed man is just a product of nature and there is no God, and that we're just progressing through evolutionary means, then ultimately there is no meaning for us, there is no reason for us to act in a certain way toward one another. There would not be that oughtness that Dr. Bridges talks about. So we need to understand how these things come together. And so in the next segment, we're really going to pursue the background. We're going to talk about the differences between evolution and more the creation through intelligent design. And also we're going to look at a model that Fazale Rana and Reasons to Believe has been working on. And we'll delve into some of the things that he writes about in his book, Who is Adam?, which deals with the origin of man. And we're going to explore those things. So hang on. This next segment will be very valuable for you to join in on and to really think through. But I appreciate the good foundation that was laid up to this point. So thank you, guys. We'll be back in a few minutes.
Do you have a Samsung Smart TV? Would you like to watch the Trinity Channel on your Samsung Smart TV device? We'd like to share with you an easy way to set up the Trinity Channel and view it on any Samsung Smart TV. If you set the home page on your browser to this address shown on the screen, the Trinity Channel will broadcast live upon entering the browser. It takes about 5 seconds to load the website once entering the browser. If you have any questions about setting up the Trinity Channel on your Samsung Smart TV device, please give ABN a call at 248-416-1300 and we'll be happy to help you.
Welcome back to our show for today. We're dealing with the origin issue, origin of man, and we're looking at the implications if man had just evolved through natural forces without God involved in the picture at all. What would that say about us as man? What would be our actions toward one another? Perhaps that's why we are seeing such a confusion of actions and morality issues today, because we have lost our way. We have lost our understanding of how we connect with not only our own world, but the greater world that is a spiritual world. And so we are here today to look at this interaction between the Bible and science in regard to the origin of man. We have three special guests with us today: Dr. Fazale Rana of Reasons to Believe, Jonathan McLatchie, who has dealt extensively with forensic biology and other issues, and he's working on a PhD in cell biology now. And also we have Dr. J.T. Bridges from Southern Evangelical Seminary, and he's helping us grapple with the philosophical issues involved, as well as later we'll see a critique of some of these things. So thank you guys for being with us today. And I want to start off, and I want to go to Dr. Rana, because Fazale Rana has written a book, Who is Adam, and he's laid out a lot of these issues, and we're going to use this as a way of pegging our arguments and our understanding of these issues. So first I want to lay out what the biblical view of origins would be. Then we'll talk about the secular view, the Darwinian, the genetic views that are out there. And then we'll look at theistic evolution and some differences between intelligent design and other things, trying to work our way through to a better understanding of how the Bible and science can relate together and how we as Christians can start looking at this relationship. So first, Faz, I wonder if you can lay out more of just an overview of the biblical view of the origin of man. What does that mean?
Yeah, well, from my perspective, as I read Scripture, I would argue that it teaches that human beings, first and foremost, are unique among all other creatures that God made, in that we bear the image of God, the imago Dei. And that Scripture teaches, as I read it, that Adam and Eve were the very first human beings, and that they gave rise to all humanity. And so this image of God is propagated to all human beings because they are all descendants of Adam and Eve. And then Scripture also teaches that Adam and Eve fell, and as a result of the fall, lost fellowship with the Creator, and that original sin was somehow propagated to all humanity as well. And so I think these ideas, again, are core central ideas to the biblical view of human origins. Those are, in my mind, the non-negotiables. And as Jonathan pointed out, there are many passages in the Old and the New Testament that, again, indicate that this indeed is the biblical understanding of human origins, that there was, again, a primordial Adam and an Eve.
Okay, thank you for that. We're going to come back to some of those biblical scriptures, and you've outlined those pretty well in an article that I will be alluding to. But I want to go to Jonathan. As a biologist, how would you look at this, the biblical view of the origin of man, and what is important about that?
Sure, I completely agree with what Fuzz has said, that the Bible makes it very plain that man is specially created. He bears the image of God, and in that sense he's intrinsically valuable, and we are more intrinsically valuable, I would argue, than non-human animals, the non-human animal kingdom. And so that has, I think, great bearing on how you view many, many issues. I think the biblical creation narrative portrays man as having been created perfect. It was declared, along with the rest of creation, as being very good. And man fell. He was tempted by the serpent, who tempted Eve, and then both Adam and Eve fell in the garden, eating the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so they recognized that they were naked and they were ashamed, and ultimately they were banished from the Garden of Eden, and they brought into the world the curse, which results in death, and death was the consequence of sin. God said, on the day that you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall surely die. And they died both in a physical sense, ultimately, but they died also in a spiritual sense. And by spiritual death, I mean separation from the intimacy of the communion that they once enjoyed with God in the Garden of Eden. It says that they walked, that they would walk, and God would walk in the cool of the day in the Garden of Eden. And when they fell, they hid themselves from God. And so this intimate communication and communion and fellowship that they had with God was severed at that point. And we believe that it's only by virtue of the cross of Christ that man was ultimately reconciled to God by his blood shed upon the cross.
Okay, very good point there, because if we are just creatures, again, here because of natural means and having no link to a God, then what do we do with sin? It's nothing. It doesn't mean anything. We'll get back to that. I want to go to JT for a moment. And JT, I want to give you a scenario dealing with the same issue. Let's say that you had a secular evolutionist come up to you and he were to ask you, why should he believe in a biblical view of the origin of man? Basically, what would you try to say to him?
Well, since I'm not a scientist, I would move the ground first. Mm-hmm. And what I would say is that, going back to at least Aristotle, we have Aristotle defining man as a rational animal, and to not confuse rationality with just mere what we might just call intelligence, because certainly animals are intelligent. The question is, are they rational? Can they reason from universal conditions to individual particular situations? And that's the question that I would pose to our hypothetical secular evolutionist. That I would say that the philosophical evidence that man is something more than animal is it's open to not just present inductive reasoning. That is, we can interact with humans, but we ourselves are human. We have this sort of introspective access to what it means to be human in a way that we don't to mean what it means to be a chimpanzee or a bat or an oak tree, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And so I don't think obscure scientific, obscure fragmented, highly theoretical scientific posturing should be something that trumps our introspective, philosophical, and spiritual experiences of what it means to be man. Okay. And so I think I would drag the debate in the direction of the philosophy of mind. Okay.
And the reason that we need to be aware of that is that, of course, there are a number of facets to this whole question about the biblical view of man and his origins, theological, philosophical, scientific, and we're focusing on the philosophical and scientific today. Before we go on, and later I'm going to have Fuzz kind of give an overview of the reasons to believe model, but right now, Fuzz, I wonder if you could give us a little bit of background on the secular view of the origin of man, especially Darwinian and genetic pursuits.
Sure. Well, from an evolutionary perspective, the broad narrative would simply be that human beings are the product of a 6 to 7 million year evolutionary history that began when some kind of primate gave rise to two separate lineages, one leading to modern humans and the other leading to the chimpanzees and bonobos. And they would argue that evidence for human evolution can be found in the fossil record, where we see these hominids like Australopithecus afarensis or Lucy, or Homo habilis or Homo erectus, Neanderthals, as being transitional forms documenting this evolutionary ascent of man. And they would also argue that genetic similarities between humans and the great apes, and in fact between humans and other creatures, reflects an evolutionary history where those shared features reflect evidence for common descent from, again, a shared evolutionary ancestor. So in a nutshell, that would be the evolutionary paradigm, and would be some of the major categories of evidence that would be cited in favor of the idea of human evolution.
Okay. Thank you, Fuzz, for that beginning point. I'm going to come back to you in a couple minutes, and I want you to kind of put on a hat as an evolutionist and argue from some of their points of our maybe Darwinian viewpoint or a genetic viewpoint, and try to tell us what an evolutionist would say in that regard. But let's go to Jonathan, and what would you say would be the importance of understanding, what would be important in understanding the secular view of origins of man?
Well, as Fuzz already alluded to, we the consensus model, the secular model, would maintain that we descended from a common ancestor with chimpanzees, and we split from the lineage leading to modern chimpanzees approximately 6 million years ago, and as Fuzz already alluded to, there's a number of categories of evidence that evolutionists would use to justify that viewpoint. One of them would be the fossil evidence, one of them would be the molecular evidence, and so forth. The nested hierarchical distributions or the phylogenetic trees, which many would argue support a human-chimp shared ancestry. There's also the fusion of chromosome 2 in human lineage. We have 46 chromosomes as humans, whereas other primates have 48. And so it's hypothesized by evolutionists that there was a fusion event which resulted in two chromosomes fusing together. And there's some evidence for this associated with chromosome 2 in humans. That we see what's called interstitial telomeric sequences, where basically these telomeric sequences, which these nucleotide bases TTAGGG is this repetitive sequence along telomeres at the ends of chromosomes, which in the case of chromosome 2, you see them actually in the middle, which is thought to be evidence of a fusion event. We also see in chromosome 2 secondary alpha satellite DNA, which is thought to signify an extra centromere. So there's various lines of arguments that that evolution is used to support that viewpoint.
Okay, thank you for introducing that, Jonathan. I want to go back to Fuzz, and Fuzz, I'm going to make you our honorary atheistic evolutionist now. And what would you give as some of the prevalent arguments for Darwinian or genetic evolution?
Well, when it comes to the fossil record, if I was, again, an evolutionary biologist who took an atheistic perspective, I would basically say that when we look at the fossil record, we see what appears to be a progression of different traits that define modern humans, but we see this progression of traits through the fossil record where they go from a more primitive form to a more advanced form, and that we see these transitional forms that seem to display, in some instances, a mosaic of properties, showing primitive properties and advanced properties. And the argument would be that these mosaic characteristics are reflecting essentially different stages in that evolutionary process. Then I would turn to the genetic evidence and I would say, look at these shared features that we see in the genomes of humans and the great apes. And as Jonathan pointed out, we can organize those shared features in the form of these evolutionary trees that seem to show that humans and chimps share a common ancestor. But even more than the shared sequences, we actually see sequences in genomes that appear to be non-functional, that seem to have arisen through a variety of different biochemical mechanisms, and that these features that are non-functional are shared in genomes of humans and the great apes. And they are shared in identical locations. And so this indicates that they are vestiges of an evolutionary history, that not only do we have an actual fossil record with the hominins that, again, document an evolutionary history, we have a molecular fossil record in the human genome that shows this evolutionary history. And so the idea would be that these two lines of evidence in combination clearly indicate that humans arise from, again, a shared ancestor with chimpanzees.
Okay. I want to pick up on that in just a moment. I wanted to encourage those of you who are listening, viewers out there, that we do take calls, and we have some excellent help here with these three professionals, these very good specialists. So if you have a question, write it down so you can have it there before you, and then call in to the number that you can find on the Trinity channel, and we'll be glad to fit that into the sequence. Fuzz, if you could follow up on this for me as the evolutionist, because they do give a very high percentage of comparability between the ape and the chimp and man. What is that percentage, and why did they say that, what they do?
Yeah, well, the shared genetic similarity between humans and chimps is typically cited as being somewhere in the 95 to 98% range. One of the challenges, however, is how do you exactly quantify what are genetic differences and the nature of those genetic differences, And also you have difficulties or challenges in terms of aligning the different DNA sequences to do those kind of comparisons. And so when you look at the scientific literature, you'll see essentially different numbers that are reported from different studies and from different ways of cataloging and categorizing those differences. But generally speaking, the claim would be that we're seeing about a 95 to 98% genetic similarity between humans and the great apes. And they would also point out that the degree of similarity between humans and gorillas, for example, is not quite as great as we see for humans and chimps, and that we actually see a greater genetic similarity between humans and Neanderthals. We have the high-quality genome sequence for Neanderthals, and that seems to show a slightly greater degree of similarity with respect to humans and Neanderthal DNA than humans and chimp DNA. And so the argument would be these percent differences match the phylogenetic tree and what you would expect from the phylogenetic tree, and therefore provide compelling evidence for common descent.
Excellent. You were kind of waffling there as an evolutionist, though. You were saying, well, and there are these difficulties. So I want to go to Jonathan, and you're probably studying a lot of this as you're working on your PhD. What would you add to this genetic argument?
The genetic argument for the evolutionary
for evolution. What would be on their side, and then we'll deal with the evidence against in a moment.
Sure. Let me just give another example. The case of endogenous retroviruses in primate genomes, for example, throughout the 50 million year history of primates, the various species have encountered infections by retroviruses, and if these retroviruses invade the germline, they go on to be inherited by the descendants of that organism. And our genomes are replete with tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of copies of these retroviral-like sequences. And there are retroviral-like sequences in the genomes of other primates, such as chimpanzees and gorillas and so forth, macaques. And so you can look at the nested hierarchical distribution of those endogenous retroviral inserts and see, does it form this nice nested hierarchical tree, like a family tree, if you will. And then you can look at the specific point mutations in the genes associated with these endogenous retroviral-like sequences. There's a GAG gene, a POL gene, and an envelope gene, and these are involved in the retroviral element, the retroviral sequence. And you get specific substitutions in those over time, and you can look at the nested hierarchical distributions of those and see to what extent they correlate with the pattern from the inserts themselves. And then you can look at the long terminal repeat sequences. These are sequences at the different ends of the retroviral sequence, which are involved in promoters and enhancers in the retrovirus. And they also undergo changes. And because they have to be identical at the point of integration, the degree of divergence between those two sequences, or the degree of discontinuity, if you will, should correlate with the time that has elapsed since integration. And so that threefold argument, if you will, from endogenous retroviruses is another argument that is often used in support of human-chimp ancestry.
Okay, let's hold on that, because what occurred to me as you were dealing with the retroviruses and their inclusion into the DNA probably would show why a lot of Christians have a hard time dealing with the evolutionary information that they get in their school textbooks, whether it's in middle school or high school or college or graduate school. They're bombarded with all this so-called evidence, and a lot of it is way over their head, or they don't understand how it fits together, or it's just so voluminous in this jargon that they just kind of throw up their hands and say, well, what can we do? How can we deal with this? So JT, I want to use you as an interlude before we talk about theistic evolution and its impact. What would you recommend for Christians as they try to deal with this information? How should they look at it or weigh it?
Well, that's you make a good point, Daniel, when you say that the a lot of the information is over their head. It's voluminous in its presentation. I think one of the things we have to do is balance the equation of reputable scientific arguments. And so this is one of the benefits that Reasons to Believe brings to the table. They've got a number of scientists on staff, Fuzz and Hugh and others, that are legitimate experts in the relevant fields, and yet they look at the same evidence, they have the same educational background, and yet they're able to look at the evidence and render a different, unorthodox, if you will, judgment. And so a lot of these unorthodox positions just simply get filtered out in the peer review process, and so they don't make it into a lot of the literature. And so it's one of the things that, for example, John Lennox does in his God and Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking, renowned physicist. If somebody only heard Hawking's side of the story, they might say, well, physics says, right, and then they would just parrot Stephen Hawking. Right. But the way that you balance the equations is you also look at what Paul Davies and John Polkinghorne might say about the same issue. These guys are also reputable physicists that are looking at the same evidence, and they're rendering a different judgment. And so that would be a way to balance the conclusions about what the data is or is not saying.
Okay, so JT, are you saying that the assumptions that we have as we come into this subject area may color how we look at the evidence?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the areas that I looked at in my doctoral research, and that is not just the way in which assumptions bear on scientific paradigms in general, but for neo-Darwinism specifically. And so it doesn't matter, but these things are called relativized a priori. These are assumptions that go into the framework of a scientist as they're looking at the data, and it largely emerges as part of their education. So a scientist needs to have a framework for understanding all of the disparate lines of evidence that they're looking at. You can't just reinvent the wheel every generation of scientists, or else we wouldn't progress. And so scientists throughout the process of their education are not only given evidences and tools, but they're also given a way, a paradigm or a framework for looking at that evidence. And so scientists that have the same educational level, but maybe have started to break away from the status quo or the orthodox conceptual framework, are extremely useful in the dialogue because they give us other ways of looking at the same data set.
Okay, so this is a good reason, don't you think, JT, that those who are involved in science should at least take the Certificate of Scientific Apologetics from Southern Evangelical Seminary?
Absolutely. Good plug
there, Dan. Good segue there, yes, because we have great professors like Dr. Fazale Rana, who comes and gives classes, and Dr. Ross, Hugh Ross, and we have professors from ICR, Institute of Creation Research, who also come and have done Nathaniel Jeanson came and gave a great overview of the genetic development and understanding of this whole scenario. So yes, you got to get on board with the scientific apologetic certificate there. JT, that was great. We're dealing with the assumptions, we're dealing with our background, and we're coming to the same information in many ways and just interpreting it differently. And we need to kind of cut through that, and that's what we want to do in the next segment. And so what I'm going to have Fazale Rana do, because he and Reasons to Believe have come up with a very interesting model to help us understand how to think through these issues. I'm going to have him kind of lay that out for us at the beginning of the next segment. And then Jonathan McLatchie, because he's dealt a lot with the intelligent design movement, I want, Jonathan, I want you to give kind of a re-encapsulation and a critique of that particular model and give us some more information from the ID part. And then JT and I will insert ourselves in different ways. So that's what we're going to do when we come back to the next segment. So stay with us. If you have questions, write them down. We do want to hear your questions and try to deal with those. So we have one more segment of a half hour, and we'll be back in just a few minutes. So hold on and come back and join us. We've got the best coming up. Thank you.
David Wood with the Trinity Channel. After a terrorist attack, if you turn on CNN, what do you hear? Lies. After a suicide bombing, you turn on the BBC. What do you hear? Lies. What do you hear from Al Jazeera? What do you hear from the New York Times or politicians? Lies, lies, lies. I work with the Trinity Channel because this is one of the only networks in the world that's telling the truth about jihad and its origins. But we'd like to reach more people. We're already expanding into Europe and to countries around the world. But the equipment is outdated. In order to continue broadcasting, we invite you to support us by prayers, by sharing with your friends, by passing on the word of the programs, and if you can, financially. The money will be put to good use. I assure you, the people here work day and night bringing the truth around the world. So please partner with us and be sure to visit us at www.trinitychannel.com.
Welcome back to our show today. We are dealing with the origin of man and the implications of the integration of the Bible and science. We've been talking with Dr. Fazale Rana of Reasons to Believe, and also Jonathan McLatchie, who deals with intelligent design and the movement there, and also Dr. J.T. Bridges, who is the academic dean and the chief philosopher of Southern Evangelical Seminary, where I also teach in the field of apologetics and Islamic studies. We have been dealing with this whole area of trying to figure out, first of all, how the Bible and science fit together, but especially in regard to the origin of man. And I'm going to ask Dr. Fazale Rana to give us an overview of a very interesting model that he and UOS and others at Reasons to Believe have put together, a model that they feel can be scientifically tested. And of course, in science, you want to be able to test something other than just saying it, because then it's just coming from your assumptions. So Dr. Fazale Rana, why don't you go ahead and give us that overview, please?
Yeah, and the whole idea behind our model is that we're starting first with the assumption that the biblical account of human origins is indeed reflecting truth. It's the way humans began. And so we take those ideas and we try to translate them into the form of a scientific model where we make predictions about what science should discover if our model is correct, and then things that could be used to falsify our model if indeed our model is incorrect. So we're trying to produce a genuine scientific model. And I should point out that there are ways in which you could develop a comparable model that would have different features than our model necessarily, but they still would be both biblically derived models that would tap into the traditional view of human origins from a biblical perspective. And our model is basically this. We would expect that humanity emanates from a primordial pair, and that all humanity, again, descends from this Adam and Eve, and that we should be able to determine that to be true through the study of genetic variability of people around the world, that we should be able to show that indeed that is a credible, scientifically valid position. We believe that human beings are made in God's image, and so we would argue that the archaeological record, which reflects the behavior of the hominids and of modern humans, should show evidence that when humans appear on the scene, that there is a discontinuity in terms of the behavior and the capability of modern humans compared to the other hominins, in line with, again, the idea that humans bear God's image. We would in our model provide an explanation for the hominids, namely that these were creatures that God created that existed for a period of time that went extinct, that these creatures would have no capacity like we would understand, again, relating to the image of God, and therefore would be behaviorally unsophisticated compared to humans. And then we would account for the genetic similarities between humans and other creatures by arguing that these features reflect common design, not common descent. And that many of the features, for example, like Jonathan talked about, endogenous retroviruses found in the human genome, would actually turn out to have functional significance, and that would explain their distribution among the different creatures that we see among the great apes and among humans. And so what we're trying to do with our model is essentially provide a way to account for the scientific data dealing with human origins and the hominid fossil record in such a way that is faithful to the biblical text, but also in a way that allows for our model to be tested scientifically.
Okay, that's a good introduction to that. So we're looking for a model that can be tested, and of course in science you want to be able to do that. I want to go to Jonathan McLatchie just for a minute. And Jonathan, can you give us your perspective on what Fuz has just said?
Yeah, I largely agree with what Fuz had said. As you mentioned, I come from an intelligent design perspective, and intelligent design is basically a more minimal approach, which basically argues that there are certain features and patterns of the world which are best explained by an intelligent cause rather than a materialistic, stochastic process of chance and necessity. So intelligent design doesn't have a fully fleshed out, elaborated model in the way that Fuzz's model, the model of reasons to believe would. But intelligent design is simply a tool set, if you will, a toolbox for inferring that a particular feature in nature is the product of design rather than the product of chance and necessity. So intelligent design is more minimal in its commitment and is accommodating indeed to people of various approaches on the issue of creation, whether one comes from an old Earth perspective, as I do and as Fuzz does, or whether one comes from a young Earth perspective, or even intelligent design is accommodating people who are not even from a theistic perspective. But intelligent design is a minimal commitment to the reality of intelligent causality in the origins and evolution of life on Earth. And then intelligent design proponents, having made that commitment based upon the evidence, then part ways and take different perspectives on how that actually took place and how it occurred in nature.
Okay, I appreciate that. So really, as we approach this area and we look at this model further, we can say that the intelligent design, which has a slightly different orientation to the whole question, because intelligent design is looking at the design and using design inferences to give the credibility and the evidence for a designer God. Because if you have all this incredible design, you've got to therefore have a designer who is over everything, because matter itself cannot design itself. There needs to be an outside designer. Let's pause for a moment there and bring JT into that, and then we'll get back to the differences. JT, why, from perhaps even a philosophical point of view, why would we have to say that there is a designer in the universe? Perhaps a cosmological argument or something like that would help.
Yeah, the cosmological argument is typically an argument for from the beginning of the universe, or the contingency of the universe to a necessary cause, so like an unmoved mover. But a design argument would be more of well, there's a short video that Reasonable Faith did with William Lane Craig, and a friend of mine and an SES graduate, Jim Zangmeister, produced the video on it regarding the fine-tuning of the universe. So that would be a fine-tuning argument at the level of the cosmos, being somebody who's more oriented to more qualitative rather than quantitative, I guess, philosophical arguments. I would say that that one of the things that that's been abandoned largely in modern contemporary philosophical thinking is the role of final causality or teleology. Mm-hmm. And this is something that that Edward Fazer decries in his book The Last Superstition, where he takes on directly the philosophical backgrounds, assumptions, and reasoning of some of the new atheists. And so what we would see was we see these patterns of regularity in nature. We think of the common phrase, the natural order. It's not a natural chaos. It's not a natural disorder. It's a natural order of things. And so you can't have something like a natural order without ultimately divine intention behind it, because you just simply don't have a reason for these things being the way they are. Now, Daniel, if you don't mind, I've been reading Fuzz's book, Who is Adam? And one of the questions, if I can usurp your role as the interviewer.
That would be good.
Let me ask my question, and then you can referee whether you want it to go on or not. Fuzz, one of the things that I found interesting in the book, and I'm hoping you can maybe shed some more light on this, is the idea of a culture emerging in some of these earlier, I guess, hominid lines. I don't have the vocabulary, but non-human predecessors to human-like primates, I guess. When you talk about culture among these creatures, what exactly are some pieces of evidence that a evolutionist might point to in terms of and define that as culture? I guess I was unclear about that.
JT, you're bringing up a really, really good point, and that is the way in which terms are used by anthropologists. Sometimes that can be confusing to people who are just not, again, familiar with how that terminology is being used. And anthropologists talk about tool use and about culture, about technology, and we get the impression that those terms are being used in the way that we would use them in our day-to-day conversations. But the fact of the matter is, again, we want to be careful about maybe over-attributing capabilities to these hominins because they had tool technology or tool usage and because they had culture. So, for example, Homo habilis is believed to be the first hominid that engaged in the production of stone tools. Although this idea is being questioned now, there may be some evidence that hominins a little bit earlier than Homo habilis were engaged in stone tool production. Nevertheless, the types of tools that they were making were essentially these stone flakes, where they were taking what's called a hammer stone and striking a core stone and producing flakes. And those flakes were essentially the tools. These were expedient tools that these creatures were using. And so this would be the technology that they possess. This is the type of tools they would possess. There was some organization of Homo habilis in some kind of group framework that would essentially constitute the culture that these creatures had. So that's how anthropologists are using those terms. And what's interesting is when you look at the archaeological record, you see that, for example, the technology that Homo habilis used, which appeared, roughly about 2 million years ago and disappeared maybe about 1.5 million years ago, it's called the Oldowan or the Type 1 technology or Mode 1 technology, basically remained unchanged for a significant period of time. And the quality of the tool production that they're engaged in and the culture that they display is comparable to that which you see chimpanzees engaging in the wild or in captivity. Chimpanzees make stone tools, by the way, that are similar to what Homo habilis and even what Homo erectus was engaged in. And so you see this technology that is similar to what you see other animals engaged in, but I don't think that technology reflects a capacity that we would consider to be the image of God. But now when you see modern humans coming on the scene, what we see is, in conjunction with the first appearance of anatomically modern humans, is a very great discontinuity in terms of their technical capability. Human beings are making very sophisticated tools using very sophisticated manufacturing practices. They're engaged in very sophisticated hunting practices. They're producing musical instruments. They're engaged in cave art production. They're engaged in the production of statuettes or figurative art. We see the capacity for language. We see a very complex societal framework that the very first humans are operating in. We see grandparents taking care of a young, which serves as a mode for information transfer. And we see evidence for religious expression as well. And we don't see any evidence for this, at least evidence that stands up to any kind of critical scrutiny for any of the other hominins. And in fact, when you look at the behavior of the hominins in light of what you see chimpanzees doing in the wild, their behavior is more comparable to that of chimps than it is to that of modern humans. And so when it comes to, again, this idea of culture, there seems to be a significant difference between that of modern humans and other creatures, including Neanderthals and Homo erectus. In fact, there's an emerging movement among anthropologists, even anthropologists who would embrace an evolutionary framework that says there really is such a thing as human exceptionalism, and that there is a chasm or a gap between what humans are doing and what any other creature has ever done. And that chasm creates a really big question mark from an evolutionary standpoint as to how do you explain the emergence of human exceptionalism, because it seems to happen rather suddenly as part of a discontinuity in the archaeological record.
JT, you want to respond to that or ask further?
No, I just thank you for that. It seems to me that even in the process of calling what Homo habilis is doing culture and technology, the vocabulary itself is skewed toward an assumption that there is an evolutionary continuity between these hominids and later humans. It would be like saying that a dog's bark is something like primitive speech, because it doesn't seem like it's really culture or it's really technology in any meaningful sense.
Yeah. That's a good point, and that probably will be a good way of getting into the further aspect of the model, because Fuzz, when we go down to it, we're really looking at how you could say, with all of what you just said, how can we say that there was an historical Adam and Eve? What pinpoints that? What is the evidence? And why is there even a difference between what you say is pre-Adamic in this way, cultural, and whether it is or not? What is the evidence for an historical Adam, in your view?
Now, to me, one of the most remarkable advances in anthropology has been the use of DNA sequence data to try to reconstruct the origin of humanity. And
mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomal?
Exactly. And when we look at the genetic variability of people around the world with respect to mitochondrial DNA, it looks as if everybody on the planet traces an origin back to a single ancestral sequence of mitochondrial DNA. And even evolutionary biologists argue that that ancestral sequence corresponds to a single female individual. And so when it comes to mitochondrial DNA, we all trace our origin back to a single mother, if you will. And so in Genesis 3:20, when it says Adam named his wife Eve, she would become the mother of every living person. With respect to mitochondrial DNA, that in fact is a scientifically true statement. We also see, with regard to Y chromosomal DNA.
Before you do that, Fuzz, could you say what is mitochondrial DNA and why would it show that?
Okay, mitochondrial DNA is a small circular piece of DNA that is found in organelles known as mitochondrion. And these organelles, there's probably thousands of them in every cell in our body, basically are inherited from mother to child. Okay. And so my children have my wife's mitochondrial DNA. They don't have my mitochondrial DNA. And because it's a small circular piece of DNA that has a very clean pattern of inheritance, because it doesn't undergo recombination, it gives us a very clear signature or signal for the origin of humanity, tracing the maternal lineage.
Okay.
And then Y chromosomal DNA is, of course, inherited from father to son. And there is a region of the Y chromosome called the non-recombining region of the Y, and so it doesn't recombine either, so it gives us a very clean signal, if you will, and that shows that every man on the planet traces an origin back to a single ancestral sequence of Y chromosomal DNA that again corresponds to a single male individual. And these are dubbed mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam in the scientific literature. And it's my contention that this is actually evidence for the biblical account of human, the biblical account of human origins. But what's also exciting is that there's other regions of DNA in our genomes, in the nuclear part of our genomes, that don't give us quite a clean pattern of inheritance and quite a clean signature, but two also indicate that humanity must originate from very recently from a very small population of individuals that again would be in alignment with the data that we get from the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosomal DNA. And in addition to that, people have even studied genetic variability with respect to human parasites, with the idea that these parasites have such a close association with human beings that their transmission is going to mirror basically human history. And that genetic variability also shows, again, a pattern very similar to what you get from the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosomal DNA. So we've got this emerging picture from molecular anthropology that says humanity originates recently, about 100,000 years ago, which I think is compatible with the biblical text, from, again, a very small population of individuals traceable back to these single ancestral sequences, and that the location of humanity's origin is very close to where we think the Garden of Eden would have been. And so I would argue that when you're willing to interpret the data from molecular anthropology from a biblical framework, it's extremely provocative, it's extremely suggestive that there's scientific credibility to this biblical account of human origins. Now, to be clear, evolutionary biologists interpret this data from within the framework of the evolutionary paradigm. And so what we do in Who Was Adam is we describe how evolutionary biologists interpret this data and then point out why we think our interpretation is equivalent or maybe even superior to an evolutionary interpretation. But nevertheless, I find the results from molecular anthropology extremely provocative and again suggest that there very well could be scientific credibility to this biblical account of human origins, that it's not something that we have to embrace as a theological history that may not reflect actual history or science, but it's a theological construct that kind of speaks about human origins and from an everyman's position, but that we can look at this account as literally being true and, again, having scientific support.
Okay. So basically, you're saying that we can use scientific evidence to give support to what the Bible is saying and has been saying since it was written down, that we were created in the image of God, that we have a special purpose in this world, and we have a special relationship to the God of this world. And rather than science separating us from that whole realm of understanding and actually being, we can use science in a very positive way. Jonathan, what would you say to this model? What could you add with your background?
Yeah, what Fuzz has done is make a case that a primordial pair, an Adam and Eve couple, is plausible. It's not necessarily in conflict with modern science. I don't think that his case demonstrates the existence of an Adam and Eve, and I think you would agree with me on that. It only demonstrates that it's at least plausible that there was a historical Adam and Eve. Most, as Fuzz mentioned, evolutionary biologists are going to interpret this data within the framework of an evolutionary paradigm. And so they would understand this Y chromosomal Adam, if you will, mitochondrial Eve, to be the last universal common ancestor of the current human population. They wouldn't necessarily see those individuals as being the only individuals alive at that time, and in fact, I think very few biologists would take that view. So I think what Fuzz has done is present as a case for plausibility rather than an argument that compels belief in Adam and Eve.
Okay, so Jonathan, you're saying that evolutionists would posit that there were perhaps a number of different groups of individuals who evolved this way or that way. Some died out, and those that survived were the ones that passed on their inheritance to what became Homo sapiens, our particular view of or type of mankind. Is that what you're saying?
Right. Most evolutionary biologists would say that yes, we go back to that modern humans go back to a single pair, but there were other individuals alive. Right.
Okay, Fuzz, how would that work within your model, and how would it be testable, and so on?
Just to make this point real quickly, I think Jonathan makes a really good point, is that we've demonstrated plausibility. I would be reticent to say that we've proved Adam and Eve's existence, but we've demonstrated plausibility. But this is where our creation model approach, I think, becomes very important, because we basically propose a scientific model where we make the prediction that we should see evidence that humanity comes from a primordial pair. And so with the discovery of mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam that do indeed correspond to, again, a single female individual and a single male individual, we have shown that a key prediction of our model is actually satisfied by the data. So that's where the creation model approach, I think, has value. It's a subtle, maybe nuanced point, but I think it's a significant point. Now, as Jonathan points out, evolutionary biologists argue that there was a population of individuals, not a primordial pair, that there very well could have been a real person called mitochondrial Eve and a real person called Y chromosome Adam, but that they were part of a larger population where those other members of that populations had their lineages, their genetic lineages die out as humanity progressed from that population. And my response to that would be that part of the claim that there was a population of individuals is essentially a theory-laden idea. That is, from an evolutionary perspective, individuals don't evolve, populations evolve. So if you're looking at human origins from an evolutionary standpoint, by definition, there had to be an original population. There couldn't have been a primordial pair. That would be an absurdity from an evolutionary standpoint. So in a sense, the claim that there was a population is largely influenced by looking at the data from an evolutionary framework. Now, evolutionary biologists would also argue that when you look at the genetic variability of people around the world, it's simply too great to be accommodated by a primordial pair. And they have these equations that relate the original population size to genetic variability and mutation rates, and they argue that when you plug in the data into these equations, you wind up with population sizes that are on the order of a few thousand, not a primordial pair. But as we point out in the updated edition to Who Was Adam, is that these equations actually don't seem to work very well in known circumstances from conservation biology, where we know original population sizes and we can measure genetic variability at different points in time. What we end up seeing is genetic variability that's far greater than what you would predict given the original population size and the use of these models, which suggests that these models may not be very reliable. And so our point would be that, again, while evolutionary biologists would disagree with our interpretation of mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam, I don't believe that their interpretation that there was a population has actually been established in a compelling way, scientifically speaking.
Okay, so the population studies would be very helpful, and of course, again, you're dealing with assumptions. We only have a couple minutes left, and so I want to give a chance to each speaker to give their basic idea of why it's important, again, to be able to support what the Bible is saying with science. So Jonathan, let's start with you, then go to JT, and we'll end up with Fuzz. Why is it important to have science and Bible figured together?
Why is it important to have science and the Bible figured together? Well, as I outlined at the beginning of this interview, the Bible is making claims about reality, and so science comes from the Latin scientia or scientia, which means knowledge, and so science is the quest for knowledge, and what is So that's why it's so important.
Okay, so we ultimately want to know why we are here, what we can know, and science gives us the tools. So it is a tool of discovery, a tool of knowledge, of understanding. So that's a very good way to put it. JT, what would you say about the interface between science and the Bible?
Yeah, I would just point out that, look, at the beginning of the 21st century, it's possible that as we develop sciences like cosmology, astrobiology, origin of life chemistry, and paleoanthropology, that we would have discovered many different scientific evidences contrary to Christianity. That would have been possible, but what we find is actually the opposite. In every place that science is robustly empirically grounded in these areas that touch on origins, what Fuzz says earlier reemerges, and that is not only with human origins but all other important questions of origins. We find that Christianity and science are compatible in some reasonable, rational way. That Christianity's rationality is maintained by scientific evidences.
So as a Christian, we should not be afraid of science at all, because science gives great evidence for design and for the existence of God, and more than that, for everyday faith. So we can have confidence in science. Fuzz, why should we buy your book, Who is Adam?
Well, to me, I think why Who is Adam represents an important contribution to this conversation is that it's an attempt, and maybe at the end of the day it's not, by the model that we propose doesn't hold up in all areas, but it's an attempt to show that we can actually take discoveries from science, we can take insights from Scripture, we can treat them both seriously, and we can integrate them into a coherent framework that makes sense of reality from a Christian worldview perspective. And that as we go through that exercise, what we end up discovering is that there are many, many advances in science that seem to be presaged by statements that are found in Scripture describing God's creative work. And that gives us a lot of confidence in what Scripture is teaching, and it becomes a very powerful tool for us to engage our culture in very important conversations about the reality and the validity of the Christian faith in a world that's so influenced by science and technology.
Amen. I thank you, because that's really what apologetics is all about. We need to understand what we believe, and that's the Bible, the biblical account. We need to understand what science, in this case, would say about it. We need to be able to defend what the Bible says in regard to science, and then we need to be able to refute what is in error, and that's what we see with the evolutionary view, the macroevolutionary view. Thank you all so much. We had Dr. Fazale Rana from Reasons to Believe, Jonathan McLatchie, a PhD student in cell biology, and we had JT Bridges, who is the professor of philosophy and the academic dean of Southern Evangelical Seminary. Thank you all for watching, and hopefully this was very helpful, and I wish you Godspeed. May God bless you in your pursuit of looking at the Bible through the glasses of science.